Hello, guys.
Hey, Vladimir.
How are you?
Doing well.
Both of you are in Seattle area?
Yeah.
Yeah, so good morning. Because we are about preparing for dinner after this session.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
It's morning on your side. Thank you for joining us this year on Azure Satellite Conference, and thank you for I know that will be a great session, especially because topic is really interesting. And just let me know who will share screen so I can prepare everything, because this is only session with 2 speakers today.
Gotcha.
I think.
Okay, I'll share my screen.
Okay, so guys, stage is yours.
Hey everyone, welcome. So we're going to be talking to you today about Terraform primarily, and we're going to focus on some new features and functionality around Terraform. We've done a lot of sessions for Terraform, the Azure RM provider, and things like that. So we're going to switch it up a little bit today and kind of show you some full life cycle of using Terraform with Azure DevOps. So it'll be a fun session, and we're looking forward to it. I'm not sure what the format here is, but if you have questions, feel free to pipe up, and we will do our best to answer those questions. So my name is Mark Gray. I'm a program manager here at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft for way too long, and I am on a team called Azure Management Experience team with Mohammed, and we'll talk a little bit about what the team does and then kind of dive into the Terraform specifics. Mo, want to introduce yourself?
As Mark mentioned, I'm Mohammed Zehgir. I work on the same Azure Management Experience team. Both me and Mark primarily work on the Terraform side of it. I'm also a program manager, and I think we can get started now.
Cool. All right. So start by talking about what our team does so that you can get an idea of kind of where our focus is and why you should be excited about what we're doing. So what we'll talk about is give you an introduction to our team, what we do, what our mission is, and all of those kinds of things. We'll talk about Microsoft and HashiCorp. So obviously Terraform is not a Microsoft product, and we'll talk about kind of the relationship there and let you know what's going on there kind of now and in the future. And then we'll talk about CI/CD with Terraform. So most customers that use Terraform use it in a automated way. So we'll just show you one example of using Terraform in an automated fashion. And what's really cool about what we're going to show you is we're going to use Terraform to actually manage the CI/CD pipeline, to actually use to under the hood use Terraform in the CI/CD pipeline environment. So it's using Terraform kind of on both ends, which is really cool. And then we'll jump into a demo and show you the code and how it's done and all of those kinds of things. And one of the great things about what we're going to do is a lot of times demos are shown and kind of ignore the whole complication of passwords and secure settings and things like that. But we'll talk about how to use Terraform in a pipeline in a secure manner. So we'll kind of walk through some of that as well. All right, so our team and what our mission is. Let's dive into that. Our team is our mission for our team is relatively new. It's about 1.5 years or so old. Previously, the team was focused on open source initiatives in Azure, or open source products that work with Azure. It has been pivoted in, like I said, the last 1.5 years or so, and we're focusing on the management experience. And we'll talk about what that means. So from a management experience, what we're talking about is we recognize that the primary interface that our customers have with Azure is not the portal per se, at least not on a day-to-day basis. It is usually through code. And developers have preferences on what code they want to use. And we want to make sure that customers can actually use whatever code and tools that they choose to interact with Azure in a full way. So when we say that, most customers think of our first-party products, the Azure CLI and PowerShell, and we are fully invested in CLI and PowerShell to make sure that customers can actually manage Azure with those things in a complete way. But what is great, in my opinion, about what our team does is we actually treat open source solutions like Terraform and Ansible in the same way that we do the first-party command line tooling. So what our overall mission is the ability for customers to use the tool of their choice and have a complete experience and be able to manage everything that they want to manage in Azure with those tools. So like we mentioned at the beginning, what Mo and I focus on in the team is Terraform. So we work on a team here at Microsoft that is solely focused on Terraform, and we work with HashiCorp, and I'll dive into that a little bit later on that. But overall, what we're doing is making sure that you can use the tools that you want to use to interact with Azure, essentially. So why do we focus on Terraform? Terraform is an extremely powerful tool that's used by a lot of customers, not only Azure customers, but multiple clouds and on-prem and things like that. And it is an incredibly useful tool. We recognize that at Microsoft and want to make sure that customers can actually use that in a full way. So what we get a lot of times from customers is feedback on can we depend on Terraform? It's not a Microsoft tool, so is it something that they should be using ARM templates instead? And what our team's mission is to make customers, or not make customers, but to allow customers to feel comfortable with the fact that we are invested in Terraform. We recognize that customers depend on Terraform, and we're making it better and better every day, essentially. So we work very closely with HashiCorp. We have a team here at Microsoft that invests in the Azure RM provider, or the Azure providers for Terraform. That team works very closely with the HashiCorp engineers. We essentially have a virtual team that works off a common backlog, investing in Terraform resources. All of the project, as you know, is an open source project. It's owned by HashiCorp. We have some maintainers in the repo, along with the HashiCorp maintainers. So we are fully invested in making sure that Terraform support is as broad and deep as possible in Azure. Some of the other areas that we are investing in is documentation and tutorials. So there's a lot of great documentation on the HashiCorp site for the reference documentation for the Azure RM provider, Azure AD provider, and Azure ADO provider. But we want to augment that on the Microsoft documentation. So we add some how-tos and things like that for customers that are working on specific scenarios or what have you in Azure, to ensure that they have the information they need to get up and running for those scenarios. We've also partnered with HashiCorp to invest in the learn.hashicorp.com for Terraform. So if you go on to learn.hashicorp.com, you can get a full end-to-end tutorial on how to get up and running in Terraform using Azure on the back end. And the last bullet here that I think is super important for a lot of customers to really go all in with Terraform on Azure is Microsoft's support Terraform. So if you have issues, if you are provisioning a MySQL database or something like that in Azure, and I'm using that as an example because that's what we're going to use in our demo, but if you're using Terraform to actually provision MySQL and you run into an issue, you can call Microsoft support. And if you mention that you're using Terraform, the service team is not going to hang up on you and tell you to call HashiCorp or anything like that. We will support you on that. And if it ends up being an issue with the HashiCorp core, we can actually pass you over there. So you can get support on Terraform in Azure, which I think is super helpful for our customers. So what does it look like in the future? So you can call up and get support. We have coverage for a lot of things in Terraform, but what are we working on? Where do we want to be in the future with Terraform on Azure? We want to get to a point where customers can do everything they need to do in Azure with Terraform. So right now, it's a manual process when new services are added, or or to get coverage of existing services, we need to contribute to the Terraform or the Azure RM provider. And we are working hard to get 100% coverage of all Azure services. So no matter what you want to do, you can do that using Terraform. So you don't have to fall back to Azure RM templates and things like that. We are also working to make sure that new services coming online have Terraform support. There are some internal processes in Azure, where service teams have to go through these processes. Terraform very recently, the past 6 months, had it as a GA requirement. So new services that get released to general availability are required to have Terraform support. And that means they work with our team to ensure that we understand what their service does and their API is up to snuff, and that we enable Terraform support for their services. So that is a good combination of things that we invest in. So we are in parallel doing what we can to add support for existing services, but we're also making sure that new services that come online also have Terraform support, so that we don't get into a situation where we're just always behind because new services are coming online and we just don't have that Terraform support. And like I mentioned before, this is a little bit different, but there's a central team, like I mentioned, is the Azure Management Experience team. Azure Management Experience team is made up of engineering teams that work on Terraform, Azure CLI, and PowerShell. So what we get out of that is some of those things like these internal processes requiring customers to have Terraform support. We have knowledge across all of those command lines, and we have knowledge of the services themselves within our team. So we can bring the requirements from the services that come in and spread them across all of the different command line tools. So it gives us that full coverage without having to have repetitive work, if you will. So you don't have a team that is doing PowerShell that works with the service team and gets all of the information and then just does the PowerShell, and the same with the CLI, and then the same with the Terraform. It's a central team that brings those requirements in from the service teams and distributes it across all of the CLIs. So it gives us a much better optimization of that work. All right, so that is Azure on, or Terraform with Azure. As I mentioned before, Terraform is typically used in CI/CD pipelines. And in addition to investing in all of the Azure management, we're also investing in Azure DevOps, which is a CI/CD tool from Microsoft. And I will hand it over to Mo to kind of give you an overview of what we're doing there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mark, for giving us, or giving everyone here, that introduction to what the team does and roughly what our roadmap looks like. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the newer stuff that we have put out there, especially in the world of DevOps with Terraform. So moving on to the next slide, two of the things that we really want to highlight here are our investments in the Azure DevOps world. So late last year, we went ahead and officially released a Terraform provider for Azure DevOps. And for those who may not know, Azure DevOps, as Mark just mentioned, is basically Microsoft's solution for DevOps management. So when you're basically going through your software development lifecycle, Azure DevOps will give you tools to help you along that process, whether it's in your planning and development phase. You have stuff like boards, backlogs, or if you just want to collaborate on your code development, then you have user tickets, you have repositories, and then for the actual building and deploying of your apps, you have stuff like pipelines. So all of these features are basically wrapped up into this offering, which is called Azure DevOps. And now we're bringing that, or now we have brought that to Terraform through an officially supported provider. So more on that in a bit. But along with the provider, we kind of wanted to complete that experience. So we have now started making investments in an extension as well. As you know, extensions augment the whole developer experience. So this was basically to help complete that DevOps story. So moving on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about the DevOps provider that we just mentioned. So essentially, this is a Microsoft provider. We have the source code out there in GitHub, and we're actively working to grow the community there. There are engineers on our side who are looking at the customer issues that are coming in. Community PRs are always welcome. We're actively working to have those addressed as well. And we're doing our bit to make sure that the community's voice is heard, and overall just driving the health and growth of this product. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're basically, the goal behind this provider was to bring the infrastructure as code benefits of Terraform to DevOps. So what does that mean? That's essentially, if you want to, control the description of your Azure DevOps repositories, provisioning repositories, service connections, pipelines, whether it's variable groups or group memberships, all of that good stuff this provider has. And you can now just use it, commit it as source code, and then manage it in Terraform in a consistent and repeatable way. So that is the goal behind having this provider out there. And then as we go through, we'll also have a demo later on at the end where Mark can go through how we use this provider and we can provision stuff. So we'll get to that in a bit. Moving to the next slide, the extension that I mentioned earlier, like if you go onto the Azure Marketplace, you're going to see a bunch of extensions, and it can get confusing. It can, you wonder about the safety, you wonder about which is the recommended one. So we do have an extension that we recommend, and that one's called Azure Pipelines Terraform Tasks. To give you a bit of background, it's been authored by Charles Zip, so you'll see that the owner is Charles Zip, and he's a Microsoft engineer. And now the Terraform team has started investing a lot into this extension as well. And it's not officially owned under Microsoft yet, but that is in the plans for the future. But we are already actively contributing in it. We are working with the customers to make sure we get stuff added as needed. So that community is starting to thrive as well. But talking a little bit about what the extension does, the extension has a bunch of tasks that you can basically use in your pipelines experience. So whether it's the Terraform installer, you have the Terraform installer in there, you can get the latest versions, or even running basic Terraform commands, whether it's plan, apply, destroy, you can do that directly from pipelines. And then the main motivation for this extension was basically to provide you Terraform pipeline tasks that could execute on the build agent operating system and provide guided task configuration for yourself. So on that note, having spoken about both the provider and the extension, let's move on a little bit and talk about the demo that we are going to do. So if we move to the scenario slide, one of the things that you will basically run into, especially when you're trying to provision pipelines, is handling secrets. And you don't want them to be exposed in an automated pipeline. So in this demo, what we're going to try and do here is deploy a MySQL with the username and password without any exposure. So Mark is obviously going to go over some of the tidbits in the demo, but let me just give a quick overview. Essentially, there's some prereqs that we've already provisioned on the side, which is basically a key vault instant, and that has all our secrets in it. It has our Azure tenant, the subscription ID, the service principal password that we will then later set up, the GitHub personal access token, and obviously the MySQL admin, the admin name and password. And the way this demo is kind of going to work is that we're going to go over 2 steps. The first step is going to be we go ahead and create the Azure DevOps project and pipeline. And while we're doing this, we're going to do this by creating a service connection that is going to go to our Azure subscription. It's going to be like, okay, the ADO pipeline can now basically deploy to that subscription. And then the second step is going to also be using the service connection to connect to GitHub, because right now our code is sitting in a GitHub repository. And in step 2, we can then take that code, create a job, run it, and deploy it onto Azure. So I did step on Mark's toes a little bit over there, but I can hand it over to him now and fill in the gaps and do the actual demo.
Awesome. Thanks, Mo. So I think what is really interesting about this scenario, and the reason we're doing this scenario, is it really does show the full end-to-end pipeline. So we're using Terraform to actually manage Azure DevOps, which is using Terraform within it to actually provision your application infrastructure. In this particular case, we're provisioning MySQL, but you could use the same pipeline to provision the application along with the any infrastructure that you need to go with it, firewall rules, databases, what have you. So it gives you that full infrastructure as code for that whole thing. So you can have either a single team, multiple teams. So if you have a team that just manages the pipelines, that team can set up Azure DevOps using infrastructure as code, and then the application teams can actually just manage their YAML, the Azure DevOps YAML that actually provisions what they need inside of that. So it gives you that full source code for the full end-to-end process, which is pretty awesome. And as Mo pointed out, the secrets, a lot of demos that folks do just kind of ignore the fact that almost anything that you do in Terraform, in deployments are going to require secrets. So what we're going to show here is how to actually do this in a secure way using secrets stored in Key Vault. All right, so let's dive into the code here. So I'll start by kind of showing you Azure DevOps. So we have an Azure DevOps organization here, and the organization just has a single project that exists. We're going to add a new project using Terraform, and then have a pipeline within that project to actually deploy the Terraform code. We also have the secrets in Key Vault out there in a resource group that already has the secrets in it. I'll show you the code for how I deploy that, but from a time perspective, I'm not going to actually provision those secrets and set those things up and stuff like that. And to show you a couple other things here real quickly, this is the documentation for the Azure DevOps provider. We're just touching in the code here. We'll just touch on a few different things, be it the build definition, the project, and things like that. But you can see here, there's a whole slew of things that you can manage using the provider. Everything from, I think Mo mentioned it, but project, but a number of other things in here as well. So it's a pretty robust provider with a lot of great functionality. And I'll also show you here, if I search for the Visual Studio Marketplace and go in here to search for Terraform. In here, you'll see this Charles Zip extension. This is the extension that Mo mentioned that we are investing in, and that we would recommend that you use. It's a really powerful thing, and we'll show you in the demo here. but that is the actual provider that you can just get it for free and then use the YAML to manage it. There's a UI that I won't be showing, but you can actually use a UI to manage the tasks as well if you want to get before you actually jump into the YAML. All right, so let's look at the code. So like I mentioned, we will be doing some secret provisioning. So I have a configuration here that I did run, but from the just to save some time and focus on the Azure DevOps things, I'm not going to actually, well, this will run because it's Terraform, but essentially what this does is it has a couple of data sources here to point to the secrets that I need and that are in Key Vault that already existed, like the GitHub personal access token, the password that I'm going to use for MySQL, and things like that. And then, as we mentioned in the example, we need a service principal that we'll use in the ADO pipeline. So the user, well, that service principal will need access to provision to the Azure tenant. So we created that service principal. So we created the application service principal and gave it a password. And then we gave it the appropriate permissions so that service principal needs access to the tenant or the subscription where we want to deploy things. And it also needs permission to Key Vault to get the secrets and things like that. So we provision those and gave those permissions and stuff like that. One of the caveats here is I'm using the access policy here. I don't have on Key Vault, just when this was provisioned, I did not use the RBAC means of, or I did not enable RBAC. That's why I'm using the access policy. If you have RBAC enabled on your Key Vault, you would use a role assignment, just like you do for the subscription, to actually give access to that Key Vault, or give that service principal access to that Key Vault. And this is just a commented out way of doing that, so that you can do that. So this code is all up in GitHub. So we can share this out if we have a way of doing that at the end of this presentation, so you can kind of see how this works and you can kind of use that and go forward from there. The main guts of what we will be doing today is showing the provisioning of the project and pipeline and all that kind of stuff. So I have my configuration here, and what we'll do is kind of walk through the different steps so you can see it running and getting deployed and applied and all that kind of stuff. So we'll start by just provisioning the project. So as I showed over here in Azure DevOps, I just have a single project. This is my first project that's here. I want to create a different project for my application that's going to be deployed. So using the Azure DevOps resource or project resource, new named Azure Saturday. I'll give it some properties here, just a description, whether I want it to be public or private, what type of version control I'm going to be using, and then the template that I want to use for that project. And then I can decide if I don't want to enable some features of Azure DevOps. So if I come in here and open this project, you will see that there are boards and repos and pipelines and test plans and all of these kinds of things that you can have in Azure DevOps. If you don't want to expose some of those things to your project, like in my particular case, I don't need repos because I'm going to be using GitHub as my repo. I can just disable that so it won't show up in my project at all. So I will actually do that in this configuration. So I'm not going to be using test plans or artifacts or repositories, so I'll just disable each of those. If you change your mind and want to enable those, you can just come in here and change this to enabled. And then rerun Terraform, and it'll just update that project to have that resource or that enabled, essentially. All right, so we have our configuration. I'll go ahead and save that. And then I have an alias here because I don't like typing. I'll do a plan and plan that apply, and that will go through and see what I need to do. We're not going to dig into the all of the aspects of Terraform, but just to highlight it here real quickly, if you're not familiar, Terraform has a plan concept, and what that does is checks the live environment and says what is in my live environment and what is in my configuration and what changes do I need to make my live environment look like my configuration. So it goes through and does that and builds a graph and determines what it needs to do. One second here, I need to load my configuration, and it's not the default, so I need to, sorry about this. All right, let's try that again. So all I did there, the way that these providers work, as you know, if you come back here, or you may or may not know, these providers, you define what providers you're going to use in your configuration. In this particular case, I'm using Azure RM, Azure AD, and Azure. And the way that Azure DevOps authenticates to my project that's here is it uses a personal access token for this organization. So in the organization here, up here, you can create a personal access token for yourself. You create that and you can either put that in your configuration here, which is not recommended, or you set environment variables for it. So when I run Terraform, it uses those environment variables to actually authenticate to Azure DevOps to do that configuration. And in this case, you give it the personal access token and you give it the URL to get to your organization. And again, you can either put them in the configuration here, or you can actually put them in environment variables. And from a security perspective, typically folks put them in environment variables, and that's what's missing here. So I'll run that plan again. It'll go through and do that comparison to determine what it needs to do to actually get the live environment up to what I want here. And depending on time, I may have to fast forward through some of these steps, but hopefully we won't need to. So this is going through and building that graph and seeing what it needs to do. And it should tell us a summary of what needs to be changed to get it set up the way that it needs to be set up. So that you can see here, it needs to add one thing and doesn't need to make any changes or destroy anything. And that one thing it needs to add is to create that Azure DevOps project. So now I'll go ahead and do a Terraform apply plan.out, and that will plan or apply exactly the configuration that or the difference essentially that I've defined in my plan.out file. So this will go ahead and create that project, and it happens very quickly. This is a really efficient API, so it's going to go out there and create that. As you can see, it did it in just a couple of seconds. Now, if I go back to stop going to my email and come back to my project here and refresh that, you can see that I now have a new project that's called Azure Saturday. And in there, you can see, because I told them to disable it, I don't have repos in there. I don't have test plans. I just have pipelines and boards and compliance in there. So you can see if I go into the pipelines, I don't have any pipelines in there. So in a couple of the next steps, we'll actually create those pipelines. The first thing I need to do, though, is I need to add those service connections. So if I can here to service connect, you'll see that I have no service connections. And those service connections are going to allow this pipeline or this project to actually communicate with both my subscription, my Azure subscription, as well as GitHub. So it will allow it to connect to GitHub, get the source code, and apply that source code to Azure. So in order to do that, I will create these two service endpoints. Like I mentioned before, there's the Azure RM one that allows the connection to Azure, and then the GitHub one that will allow me to connect to GitHub. The GitHub is going to use the personal access token for GitHub, and then the Azure is going to use a service principal that I have saved in Key Vault. So you can see those things there. So I'll go ahead and save that first. And do a plan again that. And you should see real quickly here that Terraform is going to do its Terraform magic and see that although I have in my configuration now, I have a project and 2 service endpoints, it's going to see that the project already exists, and all it needs to do is create those 2 service endpoints. So there should just be 2 things that it needs to do to actually get those service endpoints stood up. And that will just be a second. So you can see here that that is exactly the case. There are 2 things that it needs to add. It doesn't need to change or destroy anything. And the 2 things that it needs to add are the Azure RM and the GitHub service endpoints. So I'll real quickly go and do a Terraform apply on that. And it will go create those service endpoints. Again, very efficient API. So that should happen here pretty quickly. And it creates them in parallel here. You can see that there's no dependency between the GitHub or the Azure RM service endpoints. So it's going to actually create those 2 things in parallel. So instead of doing one and then the other, it finishes both of them within 11 seconds and it's done. So if I come back here to my service connections and refresh here, you'll see that I now have a connection to Azure and a connection to GitHub. All right, so next what we need to do is actually give those 2 service principals or the 2 service connections permissions in Azure DevOps. So I will create those authorizations. So this is giving Azure RM access to the project, and this is giving the GitHub service endpoint access to the project so it can manage things like the pipelines, stuff like that. If I save that and then do my Terraform plan and apply again, it will go ahead and give those permissions, and then I can take the final step and actually create my build pipeline. So this again should just take a couple of seconds for the plan. And I can verify that it's going to do what I want it to do, and then go ahead and apply it. All right, so again, they're just the 2 things that I expect to be added. It's not changing or deleting anything, so I can go ahead and apply that and get that set up. All right, so while it's doing that, I'm going to my email and come over here, go to GitHub /sample app. So I have deployed a sample app up, or have a sample app up on GitHub, and I'll show you in my project here what's in there. That consists of a pipeline file, and that's just a pipeline that Azure DevOps understands. And I will kind of walk you through that here. So that has applied, so the permissions are update there, so everything should be good to go. Everything has access to what it needs to have access to. And all I should need to do is actually deploy my build. So I will dig into this in just a minute, but I will kick off my build, change my configuration so that it creates my build pipeline in Azure DevOps, and then we'll talk about kind of what's in that configuration. So here you can see the build definition. All it's doing is creating or connecting to the project. It's creating the name of that. It sets a CI trigger. So if any changes happen in GitHub, it will automatically trigger the pipeline and run that. So once it's up and running, any changes will actually kick it off, and then it actually sets up the repository and points to my Gray Zoo GitHub repository. tells it the branch, and tells it where the YAML file is. It actually defines what the pipeline looks like. So I'll go ahead and save that, do my plan and apply on that. And then we'll go back and talk about what is in that configuration that will get run in that build here real quickly. All right, come on, plan. All right, should just be another second. And this configuration takes a little bit longer, so I will jump back and start talking about what's in the configuration while it's running. So again, there's just one thing that's going to be added, and it's the app config. That consists of what I expect it to consist of. So I will just go ahead and apply that, and this will actually create that configuration. Actually, this configuration doesn't take very long. It's just a 10-15 seconds to actually provision the pipeline itself. And then we'll go back and show you that, and then trigger that pipeline so it actually does the deployment. And then we'll talk about what's in the configuration. So that applies, and we look here at the pipeline again. So if I come back out of this to my Azure Saturday project, go to my pipelines, I see that I now have a new pipeline. That's an Azure Saturday build pipeline, and it has not ever been run. What this will do is actually deploy my MySQL using passwords from Key Vault and all of that kind of stuff. So what I will go ahead and do is kick this off manually and run that pipeline. And then we'll talk about what's in the pipeline and what's happening there while this is running, because this takes 3 or 4 minutes to run. Oops, no variables. All right, so it's running on the main branch, so I'll just go ahead and kick that off. And what's great about Azure DevOps is you can jump in here and actually see what's going on, and it's going to provision the agent, the version, things like that, and then go ahead and run the configuration. And I'll kind of go back and forth here on that so you can see the progress and all that, what's going on. But if we jump back here to what we have running, first of all, just to show you here real quickly, the Terraform configuration that I have running from the pipeline is simply going to create a resource group for my MySQL database. So it's going to provision a MySQL database and create a database for that, or a MySQL server and create a database for that. In this particular case, it's just a user database that my application is going to use to store the user data. And here's just a typical Azure RM properties for MySQL database. This is the pipeline, like I mentioned, that defines what the pipeline is going to look like. And this is using Charles Zip pipeline. And there are tasks here. There are 4 tasks, I think. The first task is installing Terraform. So you don't need any special images or anything like that with this extension. This will allow you to actually install the version of Terraform that you need. So it spins up a generic Ubuntu image, and then just make sure that the right version of Terraform is installed on that. So if you have dependencies on specific versions of Terraform, like in this example, I have a couple old version of Terraform that I want to use for my configuration. You can make sure that that version is installed, and then you can do a Terraform init on that. And what is really powerful about this extension is you can actually tell it to use a Azure storage account for your Terraform state. So you don't have state stored locally. You can have a common state, and this extension will actually stand that up for you. It will actually create the resource group and create the storage account and everything for you. You just give it the information that it needs. It will initialize that, create that storage account, and get the state pointed over there in the configuration. And then I'll just do a plan and apply to apply that configuration for the MySQL database. So it really streamlines the process of actually running Terraform in Azure DevOps, and really simplifies the process of actually using the Azure RM backend, which is definitely a recommended way of running Terraform, so that you don't have any conflicts when configurations run and things like that. So let's jump back and take a look at the run. So I'll show you the different bits here. So you can see that when I told it to use Terraform 12.29, it went and made sure that Terraform was installed and installed that on the image. And then it did the init here. And one of the things is when it tries to do the init, it checks to see if the storage account already exists. And it actually throws this error if it doesn't exist. So it says that storage account doesn't exist at all. And then it goes ahead and actually creates the resource group or the required resource group and storage account and all of that kind of stuff. And sets that up so the configuration is actually going to use that as the backend. And then it'll do the plan. In the real world, you'd probably not want this to do a plan and then apply immediately. So you could actually do some or some Azure DevOps goodness of having the plan and have an output from that, and then have a manual step before you actually do the apply. So in here, you can see that it gives you the same output that you'd get in the UI. So you can see exactly what it's going to do. It's going to create a database, it's going to create the server, and it's going to create the resource group. So you can easily see what needs to be done there. And then it's going to go ahead and do the apply. And take a few minutes to actually provision that Azure DevOps or the MySQL database. So if I jump over here to my Azure, I have set this up to just look for the resource groups that are going to be created. You'll see here it created a resource group called Azure Sat Shared, and that's where my backend is created. So I have a storage account in there. That is where my Terraform state gets stored. And then this is the resource group where my application gets provisioned. So you can see it provisioned the Azure database there. So it's full end-to-end. We used Terraform to provision Azure DevOps, and then Azure DevOps used Terraform to actually provision my application and all of that kind of stuff. So how are we doing on time here? We're right at time. So I think that's good. So as I mentioned in the configuration of the pipeline here, when I set that up, I did tell it to use CI trigger. So if I were to go to my, let's see if I can do that here real quickly. If I come into main and just come in here and do a quick edit of my database and change this to 4 cores instead of 2, and commit the changes here in GitHub. If I come back and everything is working properly, if I come back to my pipeline and go back to Azure Saturdays, you can see in my pipelines that the first one succeeded. So this one manually, and now you can see the second one is actually running because I changed my code in GitHub and it just triggered this to kick off and run. So that will take a little bit to update, I would assume, because it needs to delete MySQL and recreate it. But you can kind of see once everything's set up, you have that typical expected behavior of all I need to do now is go into my code and make those changes, and then stuff just happens. So it's a pretty cool end-to-end story, I think. So from there, I think all we have left is any questions. Hi, Vlad, can't hear you.
Still on mute.
Yeah, we can't hear you guys.
Oh, yes, magic button on my headset.
Hi,
Yeah,
Alexander.
unfortunately, we don't have any kind of questions.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Okay.
And basically, that's a pretty good thing you presented us for this year conference. Alexander,
Great.
do you have any kind of question for?
No, I would like just to thank you both for finding time to present for us. We really appreciate that. We know that it's early Saturday in Seattle area, and probably the last thing that you want to do is present and sit in front of the monitor, but still you accept our call, and we really like
Alexander,
that.
you know us. We love talking about this stuff, so it's all good.
Yeah, of course. We like.
Great way to start your Saturday.
Yeah, we like also pure technical and full of demos session. So that's always a good thing. So thank you a lot. Thank you for a great presentation, and I hope we will see on some kind of other event online.
Online,
Till-
maybe in person. Excellent.
That'd be great.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right.
you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Take care.